In India, we spent a lot of energy about the language issue. Especially we talk about linked language, what should be the linked language. But pretty much all of our efforts to so-called encourage Indian languages haven't really looked at what I call the English class system and certain pervasive myths regarding the English language. So in this presentation of a new language policy for India, we'll just look at what are some of the assumptions that we have in India about the English language and how some of these assumptions are holding us back. And once we study these, we'll be able to understand what a good language policy for India would be. One of the myths that we hear quite frequently in India is the world is moving to English. The entire world is moving to English. And if we don't move to English, particularly English medium, then we will be held back. This is actually not true. The world is not moving to English medium by any means. There are a small set of people in the world, about 5%, that speak English as their native language. And there's only about 3 to 4% other people in the entire world that speak English. Most of the world is composed of non-English speakers. Not only that, as we'll see later on, we have a lot of countries that have advanced economically, technically, socially, and this is not based on their knowledge of English. One of the arguments that we hear most often is that English education is the way to remove India's poverty, that all the rich and advanced countries are moving to English, they're speaking English, and we have to incorporate English if we have to lift people out of poverty. What we find is the exact opposite is true. In my paper, The English Class System, I did a study of the top 20 richest and the top 20 poorest countries in the world by GDP per capita. And I took out the very small countries, like city-states like Singapore, which have populations less than 5 million people. When I looked at this, it was a very interesting pattern. I actually found of the top 20, only 4 had higher education exclusively in English medium, or only 4 had official languages that were English. So only 4 were English-based countries out of the top 20 richest countries in the world. Here we see the top 10, and here the only one that's present here is actually the US, which is English based. Sweden, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, France, all of these countries are not using English as their primary medium of education or their official language. Now let's look at the poorest countries of the world. A lot of them are found in Africa, and what we find actually is the use of English medium is far more prevalent in the poorest countries of the world than in the richest countries of the world. All of these poor countries also show a very interesting disconnect. In none of the 20 richest countries of the world is technical, scientific, legal education not available in the common language that the people speak. So if the people in Japan generally speak Japanese, they can study medicine, engineering, business, law, all of these subjects in Japanese. When you look at the poorest countries in the world, you find the exact opposite is true. 18 out of the 20 poorest countries do not make available higher education in the common language of the people. They have this colonial viewpoint that other languages than their own are necessary for science, for instance. So what we find is that the poorest countries are trying to use English medium and failing since they remain poor, and the richest countries are actually using their own languages. This becomes very clear when you look at Asia. Of the top 1000 multinational corporations, and this is again one of the myths that prevails in India, that multinational corporation means, to get a job in a multinational corporation means you have to study in English medium. The fact of the matter is that multinational companies are very localized. They localize for every country that they are in. Of the top 1000 multinationals in Asia, 792 are from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. All of these countries have their entire education system based on their own languages. So you have companies like Samsung, which is a global brand, started from South Korea. Most of its employees in South Korea went to Korean medium schools. The CEO of Samsung went to a Korean medium business school. That has not prevented Samsung from being a multinational brand. And wherever Samsung would go, they would localize in the language of the people. Except in India, of course, since in India you don't localize, because in India we are still in the slavery of English. So for India, you don't need to localize for any Indian language. And this is part of, they would localize for very small countries, but since India is in the English obsessed, it doesn't localize for India. Not because English is superior or English is global, in the sense that everybody is using English medium, but because India has accepted this as a fact when it's not true. One of the biggest areas of this is technology. I actually used to work for Microsoft Corporation, and Microsoft has, even a decade ago, had 12 to 18 languages supported in its operating system. None of the Indian languages was one of them. This is because there was no demand from India for Indian languages, even though Indian languages are amongst the biggest languages of the world in terms of number of people. So what we find is that it is not a fact that English is being used everywhere. In fact, all of the countries, major countries of the world that are prospering, are doing it on the basis of their own languages. But it is a fact that in India, we have assumed this. We have assumed that the world is English. And as a result, we have completely denigrated our own languages and also held back our country's prosperity. So here's a info chart where we've taken the sizes of the different languages based on how prevalent they are in computer usage. We find Chinese and Japanese among the most prevalent languages other than English in computer usage. Find Spanish and French and Dutch and Turkey is, Turkish. Turkey is a small country relative to India, but it has its education in Turkish. But what we find is that that in Turkey, people are using computers in Turkish, whereas in India we have this assumption that English is required for it. Of course, the biggest example is Israel. I went to Israel, to Haifa, because I had a team in Microsoft Israel that reported to me. I was very surprised to find, again, coming from India with my whole assumption of English superiority and multinationals all use English. Israel is a country which has a population of less than Delhi, yet it has invested the resources for translation, for technical education, for science, for engineering in Hebrew, which was considered once a dead language. So when I went to Israel, I was very surprised to find that Microsoft internally is using Hebrew medium in Haifa in Israel. Its emails are in Hebrew, its PowerPoint presentations are in Hebrew, the programmers are talking to each other in Hebrew, and they're communicating with each other in written communication in Hebrew. Again, when I was at Microsoft, I remember flying down programmers from Russia, because there's a quest, there's a thirst for these big companies for global talent. So I flew down programmers from Russia to teach, to hire at Microsoft, and some of them barely spoke any English. So I had, some of my other Russian programmers who had been there for a while act as interpreters when I interviewed them. I was not hiring them for their knowledge of English. I was hiring them for their knowledge of programming. Somebody can be a super, super smart programmer and not know very little English or just have some basic reading ability of English. In India, of course, we keep thinking that our software success is due to English, but in actual practice, countries like Russia or Israel are immensely successful in software, not because they know English, but because they have a culture of learning, which India has as well. So English actually is preventing the emphasis on English or the obsession with English medium is preventing India's software success rather than being a reason for it. One of the claims often made is Indian languages are not suitable for science or they're not scientific. The fact is, a language becomes scientific. A language is update when it is updated and kept up to date with changes. It becomes scientific. Like an example is Hebrew again in Israel. The Technion University is ranked much higher than Indian IITs. In the 1930s, when Technion was being founded, there was a move to have it in German because it was actually being funded by a group of German Jews. What was interesting is that the people of Israel, or actually pre-Israel, the Jewish people in that area, decided to make this Hebrew medium because they wanted to support their language. So Hebrew was like Sanskrit. It was considered actually in some ways less used than Sanskrit is today. But Hebrew was brought forth, and now it is a flourishing language, which was considered dead. It's used for computer science. I've hired or and also interacted with really smart programmers in Israel who are most comfortable in Hebrew and learn their computer science using Hebrew medium. So what we have in India this obsessive fallacy about English medium, but it's actually not really a fallacy. What is often being said is everybody in India wants to learn English. Everybody in India is demanding to learn English. Even the poor want to send their children to English medium schools. Now, this is true. A lot of people in India are turning to English medium, but it has some consequences and some reasons. The reason for this is that Indian state policy favors English. It's not because English is a global imperative, as we see. English medium is not very common across the world. A lot of countries in the world that are very successful economically, very successful technically and scientifically, very modern, um, are using their own languages. But in India, we have this assumption that English medium is necessary, and in India, it is necessary. It is necessary because the Indian state, which is the continuation of the British state, deliberately discriminates against Indian languages. If you are if you are somebody who practices law in a lower court, you can do it in an Indian language. If you have to go to the Supreme Court, you can only do it in English. Everywhere there is this distinction that English is high and Indian language is low, and this is built into state policy. If you want to go to some ITI and study some low level technical stuff, you can do it in an Indian language like Tamil or Hindi. But if you want to go to the IITs or if you want to go to IIM, you can only do so in English medium. So we have this structure, this class structure that is set up by the Indian state, not because of what is happening in the world, but deliberately by the Indian state for over 60 years, or actually more, nearly 150 years since Macaulay's policies came into place, and continued by the Indian states after independence, that privileged English. And that privileging of English is why so many children and parents that now want to rise up this class hierarchy that we've set up where English is at the top are encouraging their children to go to English medium schools. The result of this actually is that we are becoming linguistic cripples. We are creating a nation of linguistic cripples, especially children in rural and semi-urban areas don't have great access to learning English. English is not a very scientific language. It's not a phonetic language. It's very illogical in its spellings. So it really is learned through memorization and a lot of repeated exposure, which is not present in rural areas. So we have these children that are being forced into English medium schools that can neither speak English very well, nor are they being trained in their own language. And so they're basically linguistically crippled. And we are thinking that this is some great sign of progress. In fact, there is a group in Maharashtra which is specifically taking children that are studying in some of these schools, English medium schools, and holding separate classes for them to teach science in Marathi. And these children that are learning science in Marathi are learning science much more rapidly and doing much better in the competitive exams, even in the competitive exams that are English based, by learning science in Marathi than they were in their English medium schools. So the idea that we cannot teach science in Indian languages is completely absurd. I mean, you can teach science in Japanese, which is, a character-based script with over 2,000 characters, and people are doing neuroscience surgery education in that. So it is only our own limitation to keep these children in this state of deprivation. Also, it's English is touted as an advantage in computer usage or computer software. In fact, the facts are the other way around. As I said, Israel, which has barely the population of Delhi, has a software industry to rival India's. It's also creating much more innovative products that are not coming out of the Indian software market, global products. Similarly, in China, a big deal has been made about the fact that Chinese are learning English. It is true that Chinese are learning English, but Chinese are not switching their medium to English. There's a huge difference. I'm actually all for Indians learning English. The problem comes when we create a English based class hierarchy of English being superior and Indian languages being inferior, and therefore create this whole craze to not learn English but to abandon the medium of Indian languages or your own tongues and go to English. So what we find in China is that all the Chinese people are learning computer usage in their own language. Of course, Chinese is not a language. Mandarin is the dominant language, but it has a common script, and there are different different languages that are spoken in different parts of China. So what we find is that by children learning computer usage in their own languages, China's penetration rate in computer literacy is far higher than that of India. In fact, it has a thriving computer industry. It has got its own, indigenous, equivalents of social media, of networks. They also have, they are already leaving India behind in software exports, even though the programmers that are writing that software were educated in Chinese medium. The, the consequence of this is that India ends up acting like a country with 1/10 of its resource base, even though its population is large. Its resource base, that is talent that is cultivated, is much smaller because we assume that before we teach computers, they have to learn English. So we don't have a widespread program of teaching children who are learning in Hindi or Bengali or Tamil computer education right from first grade or from kindergarten, because it's all mixed up with our notions about English. So what is the way out of it? As I said, a lot of debates about Indian languages get stuck in this link language issue. Well, if we encourage Indian languages, then what will be the link language? English is the language that links us. This is actually not true. Before we had English, Indians were talking to each other for centuries, for millennia. People were traveling all over the place. They were having conversations. They were having dialogue. They were having scholarly exchanges. They were having Char Dham Yatra, where they would go from pilgrimage centers all over India. They were traveling. They were eating. They were talking with people. They were exchanging ideas. They were exchanging customs. All this was happening without English. In fact, there is not a single reference to in the Mahabharata or the Ramayana that people are having a great difficulty in talking to each other because there's a language issue. It's simply not present. So this language issue is the issue we've made up. The Indian languages actually have vast amounts of similarity. They share a very large common vocabulary. And what English does is actually it removes us from this understanding of the commonality of Indian languages and the ease by which one can learn other Indian languages if you know one language. So English is actually a barrier to integration, not a cause of our integration. And the way forward, I really feel that India is like a continent. It's actually not true to just regard it as a country because of the size of our population and because of its diversity. We have so many different dialects, so many different languages, such a huge population size. In fact, our population is nearly 1.5 times that of all of Europe as a continent. So, one of the models we can use is to say, okay, how does such a diverse place, which is actually bigger than Europe in the number of people, manage its language policy? Well, Europe has been coming into a single unit in many ways as the European Union. A lot of areas of Europe now don't require visas. In fact, there are no border checks. You can just drive from one country to the other and you don't even know you've passed into another country. So, when I travel extensively in Europe, I found that all of the countries, if you go to France, people will speak French, and all of their education, their high philosophical ideas, their engineering, their science, all of that is being done in French medium. Of course, they can acquire reading skills of English because they want to read some papers. They might, at a very high level uh, of education, the PhD level, acquire writing skills to write some of these papers. But as far as primary, secondary, college, engineering, medicine, law goes, they're all learning it in their own language. This is true for practically every European country. Nobody's switching their medium. The European Union itself recognizes 24 official languages, and all of these languages are equal. There is not a common link language for Europe. That hasn't prevented Europeans from traveling to each other's countries, from taking jobs in each other's countries. All of this immense thing is taking place. The European Union releases laws in all the 24 languages. All its public communication is in all the 24 languages. And this creates a thriving language ecosystem. A lot of translators are there. A lot of people that are associated with language can earn a living from it. The same kind of ecosystem that can be created in India if we encouraged all of our languages to grow in the full dimension of mathematics and sciences and all these different fields. In fact, India was the home of a lot of mathematics that went out from here, and a lot of scientific research not that long ago. And so the idea that Indian languages cannot be used for science is completely absurd. In fact, it's one of the areas where we're being held back. So the goal should be every child being able to get to the highest level of learning in their own language. And before I go further in this, I want to tell you a little story. Part of the motivation for what made me think about language in India was a trip I made some years ago to some of the villages in Haryana, in Uttarakhand, and in Rajasthan. I had taken with me a set of IQ tests. These IQ tests were non-verbal IQ tests, so they don't require language skills. They were all symbol based. And I gave these IQ tests to children in villages in India. I gave them to urban children in India and also to the US children. What I found in my sample was that the village children outscored urban Indian children and US children in IQ, in raw IQ. In a village I found in Haryana in Khandodra near Rewari, 33% of the children scored above the 90th percentile in IQ. Really outstanding statistic. Didn't see it anywhere in any school, including some elite schools in the US. But what I found was when I talked to the principal of that school, he specifically said that these children form an inferiority complex because of their not knowing English. Because, not because these children are not smart or they couldn't learn, but because they are forced into a system where all the higher education is in English. If they want to do competitive exams, if they want to appear for the CAT, if they want to, you know, go into the IITs, if they want to go to engineering school, want to study medicine, all of that is in English medium. And as a result, there is a sense of being inferior that these children have, and that acts as a glass ceiling, that acts as something that dampens their spirit. Now, when I traveled to South Korea, I found that almost not a single person spoke English in South Korea. Like, even taxi drivers who'd be expected to know some English because of dealing with tourists hardly spoke any English. And of course, South Korea is a modernized country. It's it's far more developed than India. It's got uh, some outstanding technology innovation going on with companies like Samsung and Hyundai. So all of this was happening in their own languages. So a village child in South Korea would be able to go and dream of becoming anything they could, becoming a doctor, becoming an engineer, becoming a top scientist, a lawyer, in their own language. This is not available now to a village child in India because we've created this big barrier of language for them. So our policy aims to address that. And one of the ways it addresses is that English education, medium education, is becoming a demand because of the pull at the top. So we have to fix the top. So if you look at the top, like engineering, IITs, the regional engineering colleges, look at medicine, pharmaceutical colleges, we look at management, IIMs, all of these, we find all the top institutes are exclusively English medium. Some lower polytechnics or ITIs that don't have the same stature might be in the Indian languages. So this is creating that demand is being created from the very top by state policy. Let's say tomorrow we said, to get admission into IITs, uh, there'll be a separate program for each of the IITs in each of the state. There'll be a program based on that language of that state. Suddenly you'll find a huge demand for technical education in Indian languages. It'll just happen automatically. So it's the demand is being created by state policy, and that is where we have to reverse it. Similarly, in law, if you want the top lawyer is a Supreme Court lawyer. Supreme Court lawyer must know English. Civil services, English is a mandatory exam which you have to pass. I mean, if you require English, you can always train people afterwards. It doesn't have to be part of the test. Similarly, in the defense services, to be a Jawan, you can pass the test in any Indian language, but to an officer, you have to know English. This is a class system that was deliberately set up by the British to show that they were the superior race. For us to continue it is completely foolish. So we have to dismantle this aura of English, the status of English starting from the top. And it's not coming because of global imperatives, it's coming because of Indian state policy. And once we start to dismantle it, you will find that Indian languages will start to get nurtured in a very big way because they will be linked to the economics rather than just to cultural hope and cultural values. So the goal is to encourage the regional Indian languages, the Prakrits, and the way we do that and the way we bring them into technical education is to have a centralized mechanism for creating a Sanskrit-based technical vocabulary that is used across all these Indian languages. As it turns out, all the Indian languages, even today, including South Indian languages, Malayalam is 80% Sanskrit vocabulary, and so is Kannada. So Telugu. So you have a law. Sanskrit is a language that has imbued all of the Indian languages. And what we need to do is use that asset uh, as a base for creating a pan-Indian technical vocabulary. And then along with the pan-Indian technical vocabulary, we want to have a common script. We have this notion that these scripts, we are very parochial about it. We were very stuck with these scripts, but these scripts were actually constantly, they have changed over the hundreds and thousands of years. 1,000 years ago, all these scripts were not even present. Some were not even present 200 years ago. Right? All these scripts were changed by different kings and rulers based on the needs of that time. Technology evolved. For instance, when you're writing on palm leaf, you wanted to have circular scripts so that the straight lines would tear the palm leaf. So based on the needs of the technology and then and different needs, these script evolved and they've been changing. All of the scripts actually evolved from Brahmi, which was even Tamil, and the Devanagari Hindi script evolved from the same source. So we need to move towards a common script again, which will encourage a lot of cross pollination and learning. So that all has to be coordinated at the central government level. So we have scientific and professional education available in the Indian languages and also in English. Again, we are not about saying take out English. We are saying take out the obsession of English, take out the status of English, which is enforced by state policy. In the humanities and administration, again, we want to move much more to the Indian languages. In scientific technology terminology, there is a lot we can get from Western scientific technology, and they can be parallel terms in Indian and in Sanskrit and in English or Latin. But in the social sciences, there is far more richer resources available in India that we haven't really tapped to. And for social sciences to become more relevant to India and to create greater change, we really need to move the center of gravity of social science work in India to the Indian languages. So that's another very important part of the policy. And finally, same thing for industry and commerce. You'll be surprised to know that Walmart, I mean, an American company that is operates in China, was fined by the Chinese government because one of their products had a product label that had Chinese lettering smaller than English lettering. This is against the law in China. The product label must have Chinese at least as large as English. So, of course, in India, we're just seeing this proliferation of English labeling with no regard at all for the fact that most of the country cannot understand it. This is completely against the principles of equity and of broad-based growth and development. So we need to really create an ecosystem in the industrial and commercial side that supports the Indian languages and also project our languages out. A lot of countries, China, of course, the US and UK, Saudi Arabia, all these countries, France, are projecting their languages into the world. They want the world to learn their languages. India, we are actually, rather than projecting our languages, we are killing our languages and we are adopting somebody else's language, which makes very little sense. Finally, a lot of the language policy issues have only centered around primary and secondary education, and there's a reason why I'm talking about this last. Because the pull for what language needs to happen in the primary and secondary level comes from how it will be used later on. If you have a higher education which is only English based or technical or engineering education, all the top paying jobs, all the fields that we've created are English based, obviously we'll create a pull at the base level only for English. But when we see that that is not something that's necessary, when we actually have a broad based, more equitable access at the higher level, we find that we can have a language formula that will work at the lower level where children primarily learn in their own mother tongues, and then they can learn Sanskrit and English as secondary languages. This will prepare them both for the Sanskrit technical vocabulary as well as for travel and other places where they'll need English or for reading international research. So this policy will revitalize Indian languages, will create a great cross pollination of Indian languages because of having a common script. Sanskrit technical vocabulary will revitalize the link with India's scholarship in the past, updated for the modern world, and will create a resurgent India both economically and culturally. Thank you so much. Happen, please visit the website bhashaneeti.org. Please spread this word around. You can contact me Twitter at Sankrant, and come join on Facebook, and let's make this a movement. It's up to all of us to make it happen. Thank you. Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.